Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon, and today we're looking at an archetype that has been doing very well towards the end of the season pre-Sun and Moon, and continuing into Sun and Moon. It does change very slightly. It only has one card difference from post-Sun and Moon in terms of new cards, but the list itself has potentially changed to adapt to the new metagame that we're expecting. So this is going to be Turbo Darkrai, and it's a very strong archetype, and we think that it remains pretty much very strong. So, we currently have 4 Darkrai EX as our main attacker. We want to max this guy out. We want to start with him quite often. Having multiple on the bench is a great way to swarm with this deck. The main focus of the deck is Dark Pulse. Its first attack, for 2 colorless energy, you do 20 base damage, plus 20 more for each dark energy attached to all of your Pokemon. So the idea of the deck is quite simply to use things like Max Elixir and Exp.Share to accelerate dark energy and retain that on the board, while every time we're using a high HP EX Pokemon and either moving between them or just retaining energy on the board so that we're doing consistent at least 2 hit KOs. Sometimes we get into higher ranges of 140, 160 type output, and that's really scary for some decks. So even though GXs are gaining more HP, there are things like Decidueye out there right now which have 240. This deck can still quite comfortably 2-hit through that. So Darkrai is still a very efficient, very strong attacker, so we are going to max him out. He does have weakness to fighting, which is potentially relevant with the Lycanroc GX as well as Persimmon, but we think these decks are going to be potentially a little bit more on the fringe side, so we're still fairly happy to just play the high Darkrai count. The resistance to Psychic is potentially also worth noting because of Mega Gardevoir, which we think is still probably a decent deck. Also the Espeon GX that comes out, and Mega Mewtwo, of course. So Psychic is a good resist to have. The weakness isn't too impactful currently, unless Persimmon gets a huge amount of play. So Darkrai seems to be a pretty comfortable, decent choice. Its second attack is Dark Head for a Dark DCE that just does 80. And if your opponent's active is asleep, it does 80 more, and we have no way of inducing sleep on the opponent, so it's pretty much the worst option to go for. Next up, we have 2 Shaymin EX, just to keep drawing us some cards. Pretty simple stuff. We don't want to have too many, because we like filling our bench with other Darkrai's, so 2 seems like the decent count, and we're also going to play 1 Hoopa EX. The deck basically means you find 1 Ultra Ball, Hoopa gets you Shaymin, Darkrai, and you're pretty much ready to set up from there, because you can start spamming elixirs, attaching your tools and such. So it's really nice to have an engine that functions basically just off of 1 Ultra Ball. The new addition from Sun and Moon is going to be Tauros GX as a 1 count. Tauros GX is a very interesting card. It's been receiving a lot of hype. I'm personally a big fan of this guy in this list because the main way Darkrai functions is by already just having 2 dark energy on them, each of them anyway, because of their first attack. That's all they require, which means that we have access to all of Tauros' attacks. But also, we trade 2 shots a lot in this format. There aren't too many decks that like to 1-hit KO. Things like Rayquaza and Rainbow Force are pretty much the only ones out there right now. So, whenever you're in a 2-hit KO war, going into Tauros, because we will play Ninja Boy in this list, and just turning a 2-hit into a 1-hit KO pretty much swings a game and makes things great for you. Whereas otherwise, you have a half damage Darkrai, you just swing again for like 100 or whatever. Now we're getting a 1-hit KO because of Mad Bull GX. The GX attack does 30 times the amount of damage counters on Tauros. So you can imagine a Darkrai with a Fury Belt can tank hits a lot of the time. Imagine it gets like, say, 80 or 100 damage on you. You Ninja Boy turn into Tauros and use Mad Bull GX as your only GX attack that we have in the entire deck. And blow something up, basically. It gets you over pretty much anything. And that's really, really cool. Helps you in Mirror, helps you against all sorts of things that otherwise are out of Darkrai's 1-hit KO range. We just deal with a threat instantly, which is really cool. Tauros on his own, even if we're not using Ninja Boy, is useful against decks like Lurantis Vileplume. Just shoving him in the active can be awkward for them to play around. Definitely if they've already used their GX attack, it's very poor. Or forcing them to use a GX attack on just a Tauros with 1 or 2 energy is really strong for you. So his other attacks is just Rage, which is 20 plus 10 for each counter on you, which is still potentially okay. And also a DCE for a flat 60, which is only really okay against lower HP things like Fomantis, Rowlet, things like this, Eevee. But most of the time you try and Ninja Boy into Tauros rather than just lead out with him for 60 damage, because Dark Pulse gets to 60 for its own 2 energy cost anyway. So yeah, moving onwards, we have one normal XY Yveltal. It's a really good card in this deck. Oblivion Wing for 30 and allows you to attach a dark energy from the discard pile to one of your Pokemon. This helps the theme of acceleration. If you've got nothing better to do in the opening turns, you want to protect your bigger EX Pokemon for later on, you can start swinging, pressuring things into lower output, lower HPs, putting those little pokes on. Putting a Floatstone on this guy is great. Additionally, putting an Exp.Share on this guy is great as a nice little placeholder to maintain some energy, because Darkness Blade is the second attack that we have here. For 2 darkening colors, you do 100. Flip a coin of tails. This Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. But thanks to Reverse Valley in this list, you can actually go up to 110, even with the Exp.Share on. Alternatively, we do have Fury Belt as well. So there are times when Darkness Blade can finish off a Shaymin EX and force a 7 prize game at the same time. So Baby Yveltal is a really nice part of this list. From there, we are playing a very, very thick line of Garbodor. We're playing a 3-2 line of Garbodor. This is really a statement for how I think the format will be going in Sun and Moon. I think there's a lot of reasons why you're going to need Garbodor and why you need it in a thick line. I've been testing a lot against Decidueye recently, and initially with a 2-2 count, I don't feel like you establish 2 Trubbish turn 1 enough. By having 3 Trubbish in the list, it means you have more reason to start with it, which is a good starter in this deck because you can Elixir onto your bench dudes. Just slap a Floatstone on these and your opponent has to set up multiple Decidueye, and it gives you a more likely chance of getting double Garb out, and double Garb against Decidueye is pretty much end of the game. But otherwise, with just the 2-2 split, I felt less comfortable. There are times when one's prized of either piece, and that can be a problem if you're up against Decidueye specifically. Just having the 3-2 line in general is going to really help you out against things like Lurantis Vileplume, where if ever you go first, you can Floatstone a Trubbish more likely because you have more access to play 3, or when you play 3. And additionally, Volcanion, because of the 2 grass decks that I just mentioned, it's likely that Volcanion will remain a popular archetype. So just establishing the Trubbishes early and in multiple counts, because oftentimes they play catchers now, it's just really good for us to have a very thick line of Garbodor. We establish it that much earlier, and we have physical more copies of Trubbish for Decidueye players to get through. So that's really cool. I think Garbodor is pretty much essential. It's still going to help cover against things like Greninja and all the other naughty things. Stops Rayquaza from reloading after we replace their stadium. So many reasons why Garb is great, and having the really, really thick line is just really good for this list in my opinion. I know that a lot of the American lists were just playing Silent Lab and things like that, but I feel like the new format means that we need to play Garbodor. So yeah. On to the items now. We are playing one Super Rod. Super Rod's going to be great for recycling Dark Energy to reuse. Also things like Shaymin, also Garb lines and Baby Yveltal, but a lot of the time it's going to be Tauros. If we naturally draw into Tauros and have to discard him with Sycamores or Ultra Balls or stuff like that, using Super Rod is great because it gets it back into the deck, and the deck is actually where you want your Tauros to be because it means we can pluck him out with Ninja Boy. So I like the Super Rod just for Tauros, but it's obviously a very versatile card and comes into these lists quite often. Then we are playing 2 Trainer's Mail to up the speed and get us into some consistency cards. All the usual things of Trainer's Mail. I shouldn't have to describe too many reasons why that card is in the list. For Max Elixir, obviously the deck is all about flooding the board of energy and trying to maintain it, so Max Elixir is going to be helpful in that regard. For Ultra Ball, I mentioned earlier how great it is that Hoopa searches out all the attackers we need for like 3 or 4 turns, and that's really great. It means the remainder of the Ultra Balls can be focused on getting out your Garbodor pieces, so very good stuff. Additionally, there should be no surprises when we see 4 VS Seekers for just respamming our supporters. Trying to hit that Ninja Boy at the right time is a cool thing to do, and just normal consistency reasons. Onto the tools, we play quite a few. We are playing 1 Exp.Share. It's only a 1 count, but it is a very important card in this deck. being able to keep an extra 20 damage each turn when you're losing Pokemon is really helpful. Putting it onto a Darkrai, onto a baby Yveltal, it's all really good stuff for you. It just means that the deck doesn't peter out as much. You maintain a good damage cap throughout the game, and Exp.Share is so good for that. And obviously it means that you have more attackers readily available also. Then we are playing 2 fighting Fury Belt. Fury Belt is going to mean that Darkrai jumps up to 220 HP, which is very difficult to deal with. As we all know, you're oftentimes at least tanking one hit and sometimes even more than that. So Fury Belt is going to be really essential. And then we are playing 4 Floatstones. Floatstone is my favoured tool in this list. It combines well and fits the logic of the really thick Garbodor line, so that we just get floats on Trubbishes really early on and we don't whiff the turn 2 Garb ever, if we can help it. So that's really strong. Additionally, in the early turns, because we're ramping up so much on the bench, I actually like, when you attack with your first Darkrai, I like then attaching a Floatstone to it and simply retreating to your next Darkrai. Because that way, this one's the half damage one. Forcing a Lysandre from the opponent is like more awkward for them because they're also trying to keep up and set up their own side of the board. So Floatstones on Darkrai's is actually a really common thing as well. Don't think Fury Belt is always the go-to option as soon as you draw into it. A lot of the time, I like to Floatstone my initial Darkrai. After that takes half damage, and by that time you should definitely have a second Darkrai ready to go where you just free retreat into this one. You're representing the same amount of damage, but it means that your opponent has to Lysandre in order to access this one again, in order to take the energy off the board if they're going for a 2-hit KO war, if that makes sense. So Floatstone's also really handy for the Darkrai pieces, and obviously you know, things like Hoopa or Baby Yveltal, these all have 2 retreat costs, and Tauros actually has a 3 retreat cost. So Floatstone in super high counts is pretty important in my opinion. Next up, the supporter that I have mentioned a couple of times, Ninja Boy. This is just for the combo of Tauros. That's really a big part of this deck. Now that we go into the Sun and Moon format, it's very cool to do. Additionally, it means that after we've done Hoopa Shaymin shenanigans, we can, on turns where we have nothing better to do, we can Ninja Boy, turn that target an easy 2 prizes or just a big bench sitter, turn that into a Darkrai or a Yveltal or even a Trubbish, and just make it more useful on the bench, because this deck fills up its bench quite quickly. Having to fit Hoopa, Shaymin, your Darkrai's and the Garbodor in there, you can see that it gets quite tight, so Ninja Boy also helps out free up the slots essentially. Then we are playing 2 Lysandre. It's no surprises really, it's an aggressive deck and we like to race surprises. Then we're going to be playing 3 N. N is still really good, big consistency card, just all the simple stuff really. And also for Professor Sycamore, let me get the 4th one in shot, just for the standard draw power, all the good old shenanigans. And finally for stadiums, we're actually playing a split, mainly because it's still a fairly unknown format, so I like having a split. I definitely like the value of Parallel City as a 1 count in here, because otherwise Mega Ray and Rainbow Road are pretty much lost causes without this card, so this is decent just on that alone. I could potentially see you playing 2 Parallel City instead of the split that I'm currently playing. But the biggest issue with Parallel is that it's not really an insta-play card, so it means that if you draw it early, before you've done your Hoopa Shaymin shenanigans, it's 1 less card that you can physically draw, because it's not an insta-playable card. But what it can do is, again, it gets these awkward things off the bench, so they're not easy prizes if you time it well. Additionally, reducing the damage from grass, fire and water can be useful in a lot of different scenarios. I've already mentioned Decidueye and Lurantis as big part players in the new format potentially. Additionally, Lapras, if that's going to see play, the Aquabox style deck. Also Volcanion as well, having 220 HP with the Fury Belt and having the Parallel established could be really awkward. Bear in mind, of course, we probably just try and set up Garbodor anyway in that matchup, but the Parallel City, more often than not, it's going to be used for things like Rayquaza. If you can Parallel, Garb, and N, from there you can try and establish the board back from them. But it's still a fairly awkward matchup in my opinion. Maybe you do need to play 2 if those decks are more popular than not. If you're feeling greedy and you don't think you'll see much Ray or Rainbow Road, then Reverse Valley is probably the one I would go for as the go-to stadium. Just doing an extra 10 damage is great in so many spots. I've mentioned specifics like when you can Darkness Blade KO Shaymins, but in general it just means the combination of Fury Belt plus Reverse Valley is equivalent to 1 extra energy on your board. It's an extra 20 damage, and pushing that extra 20 is really good. Again, it just helps you not fizzle out when you are getting either one hit KO'd or you've not found Exp.Share or whatever it is. If you've whiffed a few elixirs, just having the Reverse Valley and the Fighting Fury Belt means that you have a more stable damage cap each turn. So I really do like having that. Another reason why I like the split of stadiums is because there may be other decks that play Parallel City of their own, and if you just play Parallels without Delinquent in here, that could be stuck against you all game, and that could be painful. So having something that can bounce Parallel yourself is also kind of handy. From there, it's very simple. We're just playing 12 Dark Energy, as is customary for this list, because you want to hit, pretty much hit attachments every single turn, as well as hit all your elixirs. And having 12 gives you the same outs as you would have old school Aquabox and Volcanion, which are very high odds a lot of the time. So you can expect to hit at least 2 of your elixirs, more likely 3 of them each game, and that just helps your ramp get lots of damage on the board with Darkrai and make sure that you can, like I say, maintain attackers throughout the game. So Darkrai really doesn't change much with the new format. I think the incorporation of Garbodor will be more necessary. Definitely in an open field, I feel Garbodor is much safer. So when we see these early League Cups and regional events like Sheffield, which is coming up soon, I think that's the first Sun and Moon thing that we have over in the UK, the regional. And having Garbodor, I think, in a blind format is a very powerful tool because it can just be a no-nonsense card that just happens to have a blanket over all sorts of different decks, whereas things like just playing a turbo list with Silent Lab doesn't quite cover all your options. So let me know what you guys think of the list. Obviously it's not changed much, but Tauros is, even though it's just one card, this does change how the archetype can function in a lot of different matchups. So it can make big differences. So don't sleep on Tauros. He's a good GX Pokemon, definitely. And we know that Darkrai is already an established and powerful archetype. So there's no doubt in my mind that this is a good deck to start testing and a pretty safe one going into future tournaments. So let me know, guys, what you think of the list down below, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Please leave a like to the video if you did. For now, though, it has been Joe from Omnipoke, and I'll be seeing you guys in another video soon.